Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. The internet and the social platforms that exist there have been both an interesting and unsettling experiment. An experiment that we have willingly participated in. We, the users, have been a very important factor in the evolution of the internet's social spaces. We created language and etiquette that shape how a person is expected to interact with others online. But when we look back at how it's changed and how it's changed us, one can only wonder whether we are better or worse off because of it. On one hand, the internet expanded our world in ways we could have never imagined. But it's also given us unlimited access to any one person's thoughts at any given time. The web can be both a useful tool for connection and simultaneously amplify some of the more unsettling parts of society. An intriguing and unexpected place to see this play out is in consumer reviews. They're a very useful way to find out the quality and value of an item or service, but there can be some unintended consequences to these platforms. In 2020, Yelp added a Black-owned business tag for companies that wanted to identify themselves as such. And in the spring of this year, researchers released a report that showed that Detroit businesses that used that tag saw a slight dip in their ratings. Now, this is not to conclude anything about people who use Yelp in this area. It is simply an example of how consumer review platforms can have unforeseen circumstances and consequences. Mark Luca is a professor at Johns Hopkins whose work focuses on the design of online platforms. He's going to provide some perspective on how the platform and technology works and tell us why all of this matters. Now, we also want to hear from you. Do you look up restaurants on Yelp before going? And how much do they weigh in whether you go? Do you leave reviews on your own? Let us know how you use these platforms. Call us at 313-577-1019. Professor Michael Luca, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me this morning. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of all this, I want to know a little bit about your personal review process. Do you rely on reviews to help you kind of determine what you want to buy or any experiences you want to go on?
Yeah, so I think in 2025, it's hard to avoid using reviews in at least some of the decisions we're making. So we could think about review platforms like the reviews that you'll see on a Google or a Yelp or a TripAdvisor. But also if you're using Airbnb or Uber, reviews are an important part of that as well, or Amazon. And across all of those, I find myself using them, but also being thoughtful about how much weight to put on a review or when to really rely on it and when to think about other information I may use.
I mean, the important question, or the harder question, at least for myself, I should say, is whether you leave them as well, because I know I use them all the time, but I seldom leave reviews, and maybe that's bad on me.
You know, so I think that that's a pretty common pattern of usage, and it's something that's really a marker of the online economy. If whether you're thinking about social media, whether you're thinking about online reviews, as it turns out that the content that we're using is left by only a fraction of the people that are consuming the content. It's true of Wikipedia, it's true of Yelp, it's true of reviews on Amazon, and it leaves us asking questions about who are the people that are leaving reviews, what are they leaving, and it's a service to others, but also raises questions about how do we interpret that information.
How intentional are you when you leave reviews? Do you do it pretty often? Is it infrequent?
I would say I'm part of that majority that uses online content a lot more than I produce that content.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. So we're in the same boat then. I understand that. Okay, I want to start with some of the basics here. So you've closely studied the discrimination online with platforms, but I first want you to kind of describe the kind of platforms we're talking about here. As you mentioned, Airbnb, Yelp, Orbit, online airline platforms, Expedia. Can you just kind of give me an idea of what those platforms are and what we're looking at when we're talking about people engaging and leaving reviews?
Yeah, I've thought about this in a couple of different settings, and we could get into all of them to the extent that there's interest. And when I started thinking about this, really the backdrop is how do we engage in the online economy, and what are some of the implications of it for users? And in particular, there are design choices that a platform is making. We could think about Airbnb and online marketplaces like Amazon, eBay, Uber, and we could also think about online review ecosystems. So things that are a little bit less connected from the market overall. You're not necessarily going to Google or Yelp to transact, though some people are, but people are also just leaving reviews that you could read to make purchases elsewhere.
I see. And so there's a difference between the place where they have, it's like a major marketplace and there are like smaller people, smaller companies who are selling items and then just going online to see what people say about a business, a single business entity.
Yeah, that is an important distinction on it, because if you think about going on Airbnb is really controlling the entire ecosystem that people are engaging on. They're controlling the reviews, but they're also controlling which listings you see, the order they're shown in, what other information you get. Now, in contrast, think about when you go and pick a restaurant or you're looking for a plumber. You can look on a number of different websites to understand, or apps to understand what people are saying in online ecosystems, where people are leaving reviews. You might even go to Instagram to see what somebody is saying about something.
I see. And then what's the ultimate goal here? Like, what is the most useful point about having this feature?
When thinking about restaurants, which is part of what we're talking about today, there are more restaurants than you could really sample in any reasonable amount of time. So in that sense, it's a pretty low information ecosystem. And one of the things that the digital age has unlocked is the ability to read the experiences of many other people and then use that to help inform your decisions about which service to use, which product to use. So really, it's about providing new information with the hopes of helping to empower better decision making. That's the aspirational thing that the digital age has unlocked for decision making in markets.
Better decision making. Okay. I mean, I imagine just because we go online and we read those reviews, there's no guarantee we're going to make the better choice.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge that we're seeing. So the fundamental tension is that we're living in a world of abundant information. Everywhere you turn, there's just online reviews, there are posts, there are recommendations, and somewhere in there, there's important informational content that if we as consumers could figure out how to unlock, it's going to be extremely useful for our decision making. On the flip side, there's so much information, and that there's factors other than just the pure quality of the product or service that's influencing it. It can make it hard and at times overwhelming to figure out, what do I trust? How do I use this to make a better decision?
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Carrie Jr. II. My guest is Michael Luca, a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and we're discussing the impact of consumer reviews on businesses. Professor Luca has done work that focuses on the design of online platforms. He's providing some perspective on that platform, and we want to hear from you all. Do you rely on reviews for a product or a service? Call us at 313-577-1019. I want to go to the phones here. I want to speak to Ryan in Ferndale. You called us. Let me know, Ryan. Do you use online reviews to decide if you'll spend your money somewhere?
I do, most definitely. I particularly use them to find out what the business is like before I go, whether it be a restaurant or a product. But I also, if I have a negative experience or there's something that's unethical going on in the business, I also like to note those things in reviews that I leave. If it's kind of middle of the range, I don't particularly leave many reviews, but it's, either one way or the other. I like to leave them.
It has to have a lasting impact on you, it sounds like it.
I think they're valuable. I think they're valuable more so when the populace is low in a particular town, because you go to somewhere, like a densely populated area like Los Angeles or other larger cities. There's a lot of reviews, right? And there's not a whole lot of, sifting that you can do out of, 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 reviews. But when they're less so, you can kind of get the idea of what that product or service or what that restaurant might be like.
Last question for you, Ryan. When you are looking at reviews and when you're leaving reviews, the amount of detail, what do you prefer to kind of gauge what's good or in alignment with what you want?
I probably hedge on just enough detail. If it's an experience at a restaurant or with a particular business, it's usually about a paragraph. Sometimes with the product, it might be a bit longer if it's a technical product or, something that I'm using that has, a lot of features or some things that, aren't quite right. I like to be a little bit more detailed in those.
All right. Ryan, thank you so much for your call. Join us in this conversation if you also have some feelings about reviews and whether you leave them and how you interpret reviews for products or services. Call us at 313-577-1019. The phone lines are open. Okay, Professor Luca, Ryan brings up an interesting point. He leaves reviews based on like really good experiences or bad experiences, but not really in that middle ground. Is there like an issue of the invisible middle going on with customer reviews?
Yeah, so Ryan is bringing up one of the core challenges that a review ecosystem has to grapple with, which is who is leaving reviews and under what conditions. Is somebody leaving a review only when they have a very good experience? If so, we're not going to understand when people have had worse experiences. Is somebody not leaving reviews if they've had an okay experience? Again, that's going to give us a misleading view of what a business's quality is like. So it's important to think about what the motivation of somebody is when they're going to leave a review. I'll point out a second issue here, which is thinking about how the preferences of people leaving reviews matches or may not match your own preferences for a specific type of restaurant. So if Ryan hates pizza, he may leave a bad review for a pizza place, and that may be useful for others who don't like pizza. But if somebody loves pizza, that may be a little bit less useful for them. So I think as consumers, we need to think about what is the process that generated the information we're reading.
Now that you say that, in my head, I'm imagining like a dating profile with each commenter that lets me know like who they are, what their preferences are, that give me a little bit more of an understanding of who they are, so that way I can do what you're saying. But they don't come with that. So it's kind of hard to make that conclusion, as you're saying. But broadly for the businesses, not just for people who are trying to go there, but the businesses themselves, what impact do these reviews have on them?
Yeah, so I think we could think about which types of businesses are helped by online reviews and are reviews useful. And we see them in an increasing number of industries now. So you may even notice if you go onto some hospital websites, they'll have ratings of physicians giving more information to help people find a better match. The impact on businesses, there's a literature that's grown up around this that has generally found that higher ratings tend to be helpful for businesses. Getting put onto online platforms can be helpful. The benefits depend on the type of business. So in fact, this kind of links back to what we were talking about before. In a market where there's many restaurants, you may find out more about lesser-known restaurants from online ratings relative to, say, an Applebee's, which you already would have known about whether or not you had access to Yelp or TripAdvisor. So it's disproportionately useful for businesses that don't have as much reputation outside of online reviews. Oh,
I see. And then the impact for maybe small businesses compared to larger ones, locally owned businesses?
Yeah, so I would say, I don't want to sort of paint with too broad of a brush, but we could think about online reviews as tending to be more helpful for lesser known, newer businesses that don't have other existing brands, and where other information tends to be harder to come by.
I see. And as someone who studies these platforms, are there any like trends, aside from, of course, the unintended consequences that you primarily focus on, which we'll get to after the break, but are there any other kind of trends that you've noticed that could be seemingly like innocuous to everyone else, but for you it stands out as a particular just thing that people do when they're using these platforms?
I do think this matching part is important, and I think a couple other things to be on the lookout. If I'm a consumer and thinking about how to use this, and I think about this in my own decisions with it, I think about things like, do these reviews reflect my preferences? Are there enough reviews for me to make a decision? So one thing I've noticed is you could see a product that has 1,000 reviews or a product that has 10 reviews. And if there are 10 reviews, you really start to need to think about, can I draw a reliable inference on this? Maybe you can, but there you might, especially for a high-stakes decision, say you're choosing a contractor, you're choosing a doctor, you might want to dig in a little bit and think about who is leaving the review, why are they leaving the review. The other trend I think that could be challenging to tell is this a legitimate review? So being on the lookout for fake reviews. Now, every platform has an approach to try to deal with it, but I think it's just something a consumer should be aware of to ask themselves, is this real content when they're reading reviews?
And as we know, these review platforms, they're originally intended to provide users a lot of feedback on this company and its product. But as you have studied, Professor Luca, you found that information came with some unintended consequences. And we'll get into those consequences after this break right here. You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Carey Jr. II. My guest is Michael Luca. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and we are discussing the impact of consumer reviews on businesses. Professor Luca, he works on design and online platforms, or he studies that rather. And we want to hear from you about platforms. Do you rely on reviews or products for a product or a service? Call us. The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. I want to go to the phones before we hop back into this conversation. We've got Pat from Birmingham who's called in. Hey, Pat, do you use online reviews to decide if you'll spend your money somewhere?
Sure. Actually, I'll just correct you real quick. I'm from Brighton, not Birmingham. But anyway, the question I have for the professor is, does it ever encounter the thing of kind of fatigue about reviews? What I mean by that is every time I go to the doctor, I go to get lab work, I visit Plum Market, I get a review every time. And it's almost like stopped me from doing reviews in general, because I'm almost thinking every time I do something, they have my text, they have my email, I'm always going to get a request for a review. And is it possible there could be overkill on this?
You're talking about the survey that you receive, Pat, right? Once you go to a business, they say, hey, fill out this survey, let us know how we did.
Recently, so through Trinity, I have a couple doctor appointments, I had lab work, and even so every step along the way, the doctor, the lab, and even Walgreens when I drop off prescription, everybody's asking for a review, and it's almost like you can't do anything anymore without a review. And so is he encountered any other fatigue in that way?
Is that Professor Luca? Pat is asking about review fatigue. Are we doing too much? Are we seeing too much of it?
Yeah, it's such an important point that Pat's bringing up, because if we think about some of the early review systems, part of the reason they work is you have the system up there, and if you have an experience you want to share, you share the experience. If you don't want to share your experience, you don't have to. But increasingly, what we're seeing is concentrated efforts by businesses to try to generate reviews, and they're in part by platforms, in part by, you mentioned going to physician, and the physician wants you to leave a review. So we are getting increasingly inundated with requests to do this. And this is not it's none of our jobs to write reviews. It's just something that we do to help provide information somebody else might find useful. And I think there is a risk of, in aggregate, this taking a lot of people's time and effort to overload them with review requests. So it's something that we need to be thoughtful of. And for users, you could remember that these are typically voluntary. So think about whether you want to or don't want to leave a review in a given situation.
Now, I'm wondering too. Well, let me first say thank you, Pat from Brighton. We got that. Brighton. Shout out to Brighton, not Birmingham. Thank you, Pat, for your call. And if you're interested, you want to weigh in on this conversation, call us at 313-577-1019. But Professor Luca, I'm curious about the opposite side of that. Is it a situation where the more reviews, the better? Or do we want like this balance of, not too many because we can only glean so much from them?
Yeah, it's really important to think about it. And we can think about it both as a consumer of reviews and also as a platform trying to think about how to engage, or a business trying to engage with reviews. There are systematic biases that could occur on review ecosystems. Let's just kind of go through some of the big ones.
Sure.
There are fake reviews. There are reviews that are not representative. There could be different tendencies to write either positive or negative reviews. And these are real problems. Now, you could sort of think through each of these and think, well, does having more content help to get rid of some of those problems? And for some problems, having more content is useful, and especially making sure that content is representative could be useful. So if you think that you're getting reviews only when somebody has a good experience, then it could be useful to proactively try to make sure you're hearing about some of the experiences that are less good. Now, on the flip side, take something like biased reviews or mismatches in reviews. Getting more reviewers doesn't necessarily overcome them. And for certain types of things, just kind of, for example, peer effects in reviews. My review may be affected by the person who left a review before me. Then having more content doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And their platforms really need to think about what's the problem they're trying to solve for and how to address it.
I see. So I want to get to this point. You brought up bias. Let's get into it. In 2020, Yelp implemented a Black-owned label to its platform, and researchers this year found that those Yelp ratings for businesses with that label in Detroit dipped slightly, while businesses without that label showed no change. Now, this is like an example of how online feedback, while it's useful, has unintended consequences. Can you first kind of break that down for me? I know you studied this more broadly. I just want to get your initial assessment on these findings. What's happening here?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things happening here, and I think you sort of laid out the system of the platform nicely and what Yelp had been trying to do, and other platforms have been doing the same around the same time, which is trying to figure out, is there pent-up demand to support, and there specifically is to support Black-owned businesses. And to facilitate that, Yelp and others started thinking about things like a Black-owned business label that would allow a business to identify themselves as Black-owned, or ways to make it easier for users to search. So thinking, if there is that kind of pent-up demand, can you channel it? So we have some research on this. There's the paper that you mentioned and a few other papers that are starting to understand what the effects are. And generally, there's tended to be a positive effect of some of these labels on the amount of business going to that company receives. So it's been positive in terms of attention and demand. And the study that you're talking about is the content of the reviews afterwards. So we had seen a spike in reviews after a business receives a Black-owned business label. And this study makes the point that you also would want to think about what these new reviewers are saying on the platform and whether they're as positive or less positive or more positive than earlier reviewers. And they have found some evidence that people who mention Black-owned leave systematically different ratings than people who review a restaurant without the label.
I see. And your work also has evaluated how other platforms have bias built in as well, and how that showed up online. What other platforms are you seeing that kind of bias manifest?
Yeah, so I've spent about a decade now, a little bit more than that, thinking about how do we create a more inclusive online ecosystem. It's a really big challenge for businesses. And just if we think about the history of the internet, it just really wasn't top of mind for some of the early research that was looking at what the online economy was going to do, because it was focused on things like make it easier to search, help to increase product variety. And all those things are possibilities of the online economy. And that's great. And that's wonderful. But we also need to think about what are the challenges that a platform faces and what role does a platform, whether it's Airbnb or Yelp or Google, play in ensuring that they're not exacerbating societal biases and that they're thinking about the role of their design choices in shaping racial equity in society. So I had initially studied race on platforms in the context of Airbnb, where we had run an audit study and found that guests with distinctively African-American sounding names based on birth records were significantly more likely to get rejected relative to identical requests to stay with a host from a guest with a distinctively white sounding name. And when we saw these results, we shared them publicly. Airbnb had actually then put together a task force to say, well, what's the role we're playing? What are the things that we might change? Mm-hmm. And you can immediately see that there's things that a platform does that are going to shape discrimination on the platform. So, for example, Airbnb had been showing pictures and names and not a lot of other information before a host would just say, yeah, I'm going to accept or reject that guest. So they've now changed it. So you don't see the name, you don't see the picture until after a host makes an accept reject decision. And they've tried to have more automation and started trying to measure the potential for bias. So that's really where I got started thinking about the interaction between what platforms are doing and discrimination in it. And that has sort of morphed over into thinking about a broader set of platforms and how platforms could be more deliberate about this.
I'm curious to know what other platforms like that we would use nowadays that have a mechanism that we aren't thinking about. It sounds like it's photos. It's like identifiable markers that tell people, hey, your bias might weigh in here. And the more we can remove those, the more we can try and at least mitigate those impacts.
Yeah. So, and that's one part of the puzzle, right? So it's in some contexts, having targeted anonymity or reducing some markers can be a useful step. So we could think about, so Airbnb is one where that was part of the suite of solutions they did afterwards. Uber also has thought about discrimination on the platform. You could also think about LinkedIn, where people are connecting to each other and think, what is the information that you're seeing when you're deciding whether to connect with somebody, and how that may inadvertently affect your decision of who to connect with or how to engage with somebody online. So I actually think this is a prevalent feature of the online economy. And it's part of the fact that just over time, we've seen a trend where the internet has increasingly had social profiles of things. When you think about X or you think about Facebook or you think about Instagram, it's hard to just remove any marker of race from all of these settings.
I see. It's interesting because, with this Yelp study, you would think a Black-owned business marker is to say, hey, folks, especially at the time of 2020, we know there was a George Floyd protest. Shop here. This is the place where you can go support businesses. But these markers don't always do that. Sometimes you don't get people who are eager to shop. Sometimes you get people who are eager to think negatively about those businesses in response. It's not, I guess, the initial response I would have thought, having markers like that.
Well, I think in the case of Yelp's label and in the case of Wayfair, which we had also looked at, we could look at the aggregate impact of how it affects demand. And there, I think some of these identifiers have been a valuable piece of the puzzle, and it sort of relied on thinking about how do you channel pent-up demand and have, for example, a system where somebody could search for Black-owned restaurants if they want to go identify one, but everybody else could just keep doing the search that they had already been doing. And that's actually a little bit different from what Airbnb had been doing, which is they had pictures of guests that would be shown to all hosts, regardless of what the host intention was for how to use that information.
I see. Okay, that helps me understand a little bit more about, because it matters the specific platform, it matters the company, it matters, all those factors matter in how these markers are interpreted. You're listening to the Metro?
I think we're learning I think we're learning that it's not enough for a platform to sit on the sideline for these issues. They need to proactively think about what are the decisions they're making and how are they avoiding some of the unintended consequences, and ideally being a positive contributor to their mission at the end of the day.
You're listening to the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. My guest is Michael Luca. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University. We are discussing the impact of customer reviews on businesses, and Professor Luca's work specifically focuses on the design of these online platforms. I want to go to the phones. We've got Greg from Birmingham here. Greg, how do online reviews show up in your daily life?
Well, I'm a regular user of them, but also I'm a tradesman, and so I will show up at people's places, and they'll say, "Oh, I heard word of mouth about you, or I saw a good review on you," and almost all of my customers are great to deal with, and then they have an opportunity to kind of review and explore me, but I have no ability to review or explore them. So we have, a way of going back and forth in Uber and on eBay and on Airbnb. But how do I find out if a customer is decent to deal with? I wish that we had some way that contractors could flag particular people because they're difficult to deal with. Believe it or not, there are some out there that are very difficult to deal with.
Thanks for your call, Greg. We appreciate that and your question. It sounds like, Professor Luca, Greg's question addressed something that's similar to what I believe rideshare services do, where the drivers can rate the riders. But let's answer his question. He's asking about customers being reviewed. Do we see that kind of showing up in the review ecosystem anymore, like specifically for contractors, independent businesses that sometimes have to choose their customers?
Yeah, it's an important question to be thinking about. And I think in the context of online, and remember we had talked about this distinction between an online marketplace and a review platform. In an online marketplace, often you see the full transaction. So take Airbnb. You see who the host was. You see who the guest was. So in there, you do have this reciprocal reviewing, hosts leaving a review for the guests, guests leaving a review for the host. And that's part of what makes that marketplace, that's the backbone of an Airbnb. You see it on Uber. It's a little bit harder to implement on, say, Google reviews, where they don't necessarily see the whole ecosystem, and there's not that awareness of the final transaction. I don't know if Thumbtack and other platforms like that may have a little bit of that, but I agree that it's an important issue, and you'd want to see, so Greg mentions people who are difficult to deal with, but you also may want to know, is this person paying at the end? Is this person going to fulfill their part of it? Are they going to have 4 different change requests in the process? And that type of information can be valuable, and thinking about ecosystems where we could build out this type of reciprocal flow of information, whether it's through reviews or some other mechanism, is a valuable way to create a trustworthy market.
I see. Well, thanks again, Greg, for your call there. And thank you, Professor Luca, for addressing Greg's question. I want to stay with the listeners here. We've got Shafran in Detroit. Shafran, how are customer reviews showing up in your day-to-day?
Hi. So my family owns a business in Hamtramck, and, sometimes there are unrelated reviews on Google or Yelp. For instance, my mom and dad, they're older and they're immigrants. They don't take credit cards. The business owner before them didn't back in the 90s and 80s. They still don't, and people give us 1-star reviews for not just taking credit cards. So that, it's like, okay, but was everything else okay with the service though? With like this minor inconvenience made you give us the worst review. So it's been hard, but also sometimes people have kind of weaponized it. There's a developer that bought the parking lot next door to ours, and he's made offers trying to purchase our building, and we said no, and he's been making fake profiles, leaving reviews, and we're like, we don't even have a customer with his name. Because, when you drop off your dry cleaning, for instance, you have to give your name and phone number. So we're like, we don't have anybody with these names. So, it's a double-edged sword, and I see the benefit of it and the impact, especially with my background in PR and marketing. But seeing how it's being mismanaged by people, it's unfortunate. So those are just some of the things I try to factor in as a user and as a person that receives those reviews and manages a family-owned business in the Detroit area.
I see, Shafran. Thank you for calling and for sharing that story. To Professor Luca, here's a question or concern that Shafran raised about harassment and retaliation on customer reviews. Are there safeguards in place or that's emerging to help police those circumstances?
Yeah, I think that Shafran is touching on some really important issues here, and I think it's a real concern of people going and saying, oh, I'm going to leave a review if you don't do X. And that goes down a pretty risky path for you think what that means for the businesses and also what that means for other people who are trying to use that information. When I'm looking for a review, not looking for somebody who's leaving a review as a function of whether or not a business did exactly what they told them to do under duress. It's more about trying to understand their experience with it. Now, these can be challenging to police. Businesses can, in principle, go to the platform and try to raise these issues, but it can be hard for platforms to do it. I think it's important for platforms to be proactive in helping to avoid that kind of behavior and make sure that people are leaving reviews that are authentically sharing their experiences in ways that are going to be helpful for other users of the platform and also respectful of the business's engagement with it.
I see. So with the last remaining few minutes we have left, Professor Luca, I guess I want to ask you a little bit about the tips and tricks. You've mentioned some in the conversation before, but I want to kind of iron all of it out here for listeners to know, like, what are some of the best practices going forward. So earlier you mentioned fake reviews on products. How does someone determine if a review is fake, or that it may be like a plant in that review, and they can maybe say, all right, now I know to discard this one and to look at others?
Yeah, this is a hard issue. And I'll also say this issue may get worse when we think about the rise of fake content that's now enabled by AI, and the ability to make these things, the cost has just gone down. So people should be worried about whether they're seeing real information or inaccurate information online in all settings. Now, specifically on reviews, there are a couple things you could think about. What are the stakes of the decision? Is this a big decision? Am I trying to figure out which contractor to work with on a big renovation of the house, or am I trying to decide what I'm going to get for lunch today? So if it's a small decision, you may say, okay, look, I'm trying to get a directional sign of the information here. This seems good enough. For large stakes decisions, you may then want to think about how many reviews are there. And if there's not a lot of reviews, you could start to think about whether it's fake based on a couple of things. And it's hard to tell. People aren't, there's not a lot of evidence that we could readily see which ones are fake or not. But we could look for who's writing the review. Are they a reliable source? So, for example, on Yelp, there's Yelp Elite, who's been a little bit more vetted by the platform relative to other reviewers. So if there are people who have lots of experience leaving reviews, and the reviews all seem to be aligned with your interests, then that may be a sign that that's a little bit more trustworthy. So kind of review the reviewer as one.
It's like they're
review
verified, right?
Yeah, is this a verified purchaser? That gives you some information. So Amazon has something like that too. A lot of reviews. So TripAdvisor does a little bit of that. So platforms try to figure out, is this a verified purchase? Now, I'll also say this for people who are thinking about how to use reviews. If you're on Airbnb or platforms like that, that could be a little bit less of the problem, precisely because of what we were talking about before. They know whether or not you've transacted and are focused on people who they know have stayed there. So that's the second thing. Think about the platform. If you're on Google or Yelp or TripAdvisor, where they haven't seen all of the transactions, it's a little bit harder for the platform to vet. If you're on an Airbnb or an Uber, they're only allowing reviews among people who we know have stayed there.
I see. So then what about people who shop online and are looking to get just kind of the best information? Give me the kind of bare bones foundational elements of a good review and what people should be looking for.
I think you want to understand, again, how many reviews are there for this product, service. When you read the reviews, do they seem reflective of your preferences? I think this question of what goes into the review matters a lot. Mm-hmm. And we saw that before. Sheffron's point about somebody leaving a review based on whether a business is cash only. You may not care at all about whether it takes credit cards. And now that review is not really that relevant for you. So thinking about what the content of it is, thinking about, is it about quality? Is it about the value? Is it about a feature? If it's a feature, do you care about the feature? And trying to think a little bit more what goes into the review is helpful. And thinking about the number of reviews. Is this just one or two things? If so, just being careful not to over-index on a small amount of information online. Whereas if there are 500 reviews, you may start to say, okay, there's something systematic here. Mm-hmm. And now one nice evolution in online reviews is that when there are a lot of reviews, you could often sort through and use tools to see what are the themes of things that people are saying in there. And that could give you a little bit of information about how much weight to put on the rating that somebody left. So just kind of really double clicking a little bit to understand the content rather than just to react to the overall rating could be valuable.
And for me, too, I kind of break them into two simple sections, and I might be oversimplifying this, but there's the rate itself, or the star if it's out of 5, and then there's a comment if someone leaves that. And it sounds like throughout this conversation, you're going to want to have to look at both. You want to look at the rating, but you also want additional context as to what they're rating. And then, as you say, try and get enough to where you know that y'all are in alignment.
Exactly.
All right, Professor Luca, you are a professor at Johns Hopkins University. We appreciate your time. Your work focuses on the design of online platforms. I appreciate you for joining us and for giving us all the tips and tricks on how to leave and interpret reviews today.
All right. Thanks so much, Carrie. Thanks, everyone.
All right, we got some news from right here in Detroit's Cass Corridor. Noel Night is canceled this year, the popular holiday event in Midtown Detroit that drew thousands of visitors to local businesses has been put on a one-year hiatus by its organizer, Midtown Detroit, Inc. All right, coming up, sharp wit and hilarious insight. Stay right there. We'll be right back on the Metro.